I'm Stephanie Valoris.
And I'm Srividya Sridharan.
Your host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, we're joined by Principal Analyst Sam Higgins to discuss the state of AI in the public sector. Welcome, Sam.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks, Sri. Glad to be here.
So, Sam, maybe to kick things off, let's just get right to the most important point, which is what makes the use of AI and generative AI in the public sector different than any other industries? Like, why focus here at all?
That's a great question, Steph. There are some really interesting differences when we compare the public sector and the private sector. And when we say public sector here at Forrester, we're talking about the broad church of public sector organisations. So generally speaking, all of your typical government organisations established under regulation legislation, as well as some of those ancillary or allied organisations, including some of the not-for-profit sector, for example. Now, when it comes to AI and generative AI in that sector, one of the things that's a really interesting challenge for mission leaders, tech leaders, business leaders in the public sector is this consideration of not only what does this mean for our customers and our employees and therefore the enterprise outcomes, in the case of public sector, the mission, but also what's our social license? Where does society and the role of generative AI and AI more broadly intersect with our delivery of public services? So there is this real kind of social license and social dimension that a lot of leaders have to consider, Steph, as they think about their journey towards AI and generative AI more specifically.
So given that, do you see that there are some unique opportunities for the public sector to focus on use cases that are dramatically different than the private sector? I mean, we've heard about use cases, centered around productivity or content or, primarily around employee-centric use cases of AI and Gen AI. But how's that different in terms of what we see in the public sector?
Yeah, great question, Sri. One of the interesting data points that came out of our research, specifically from our September 2023 AI Pulse survey last year, was actually that 38% of public sector respondents actually anticipated a disruption from Gen AI on public sector services. Now, when we compare that to the private sector, only 28% of non-public sector respondents felt that they were exposed to disruption. And I think part of the reason for that is, again, the public sector is this industry of industries. So every use case that you can think of that maybe exists in the private sector, there's almost, a reflection or a duplicate of that use case in some way, shape or form in the public sector. The unique things, though, come down to some of those unique mission elements. How are we looking to, for example, reduce risk in regulatory environments is a great example. Can we use machine learning and AI to actually prevent fraud, to improve safety outcomes on the road, for example, places like that. So there are some really specific ones then, for example, in areas like healthcare. We all experience that in our day-to-day lives, but it is an area where the public sector often has a unique and quite large presence. Even in jurisdictions where there is majority private healthcare is one of those areas where we certainly see a lot of interest. And it's also interesting to note that in our recent government society and trust survey, we actually had some data back that said consumers actually really trust the use of AI in healthcare, which might be a little counterintuitive, but it is one of those areas where people, I think, really see the promise of what AI and generative AI can do for us in terms of diagnostics, better outcomes, for example.
It's interesting. We normally don't think of public sector and government as taking the lead or even being the first to pursue innovation. But I am curious, like in this case, will we see some unique cases that are innovative? Like I'm thinking, for example, like weather, climate risk analysis, or all the applications of AI and say like smart city scenarios from, everything from traffic patterns to modeling a pandemic. I don't know that comes to mind. Yeah, so I'm curious, like if you've seen any like really unique scenarios and where the government and public sector, other organizations are really jumping at these opportunities.
I think they are, and I think they are in those areas where there is less exposure directly to customers, Steph. So it is something that public sector seem keen on. As I said before, the challenge for a lot of public sector leaders is that there's this societal element or broad economic good outcome focus that we have to have. And so often when we think about AI, we think about academics, we think about the sort of, the large brands in the market producing the sort of today's AI solutions, be they Microsoft or Salesforce embedded in their solutions, be it OpenAI providing some of the more consumer-oriented things we might see, Perplexity.ai as a search engine. I mean, there's a wealth of stuff out there. What maybe goes unremarked or unobserved is the fact that a lot of these things wouldn't even be possible had it not been for, as you said, Steph, partnerships with the likes of NOAA, for example, and academic research organisations actually using large pools of big data that government often have, satellite imagery, weather data, large de-identified data sets on populations, for example, and actually feeding that into basic research about AI and generative AI that we're now seeing the fruits of. I was really surprised, actually, when I looked at the audit that federal government agencies in the US were required to do of the use cases and presence of AI under one of the recent executive orders, and that was being an inventory being developed and coordinated by the Office of Management Budget. 711 individual use cases have already been identified in the federal government. Right? I mean, I was astounded because the way that we were all talking about it, you would think that this was sort of some small, insidious thing that had crept into the sector, but actually there's a lot of uses in the public sector that are along the lines of exactly what you said, Steph. The other thing that surprised me was out of that 711, I could only dig out with ease 11 that were using generative AI. Many of them are actually using traditional AI models.
So with great opportunity comes risk, and we can't have an AI related podcast without talking about the risks and challenges. And you started the podcast talking about the larger societal responsibilities that mission leaders, tech leaders, and business leaders in public sector have. So tell us a little bit about what you're hearing in terms of what's on top of their mind on risks and challenges as they implement and experiment AI and Gen AI.
It's interesting. I was surprised, Sri, to see in the data that actually integrating, particularly generative AI, into existing infrastructure was a challenge. Now, government more broadly and public sector clients that we have, they're not necessarily at the leading edge of cloud adoption, where we know a lot of the AI and generative AI activities are occurring just because of the need to get access to that capacity, compute capacity, storage capacity, etc. But I thought that was interesting, this integration with existing infrastructure being a real challenge front and foremost. I mean, it even was higher than governance and risk, lack of technical skills, even higher than a lack of strategy. And we can certainly come back to the topic of AI and generative AI strategies later. But I found that really interesting, this integration with existing infrastructure. And I think some of that comes from what Steph was hinting at earlier, which is that there are some unique use cases in unique data scenarios in government where that data is held on premise or in secure clouds, for example, GovCloud and others. And so having clarity around how we safely access what could be really rich and important data for the future of application of AI seems to be something that's top of mind in terms of trying to address and adopt AI more broadly in the sector.
So, Sam, just to dig into some of the integration challenges, I mean, when you just said, for example, like government actually has a lot of infrastructure and data on-prem, which can be a benefit, but is that also part of the challenge, which is, and I'd be thinking about like US federal agencies, I mean, they have decades and decades of legacy tech that has been really difficult to modernize. Part of it is a budget issue. Part of it is, these systems have been in place supporting critical processes and critical infrastructure. And it's a very complex system. So there's a wariness of even attempting to modernize it. So does government have to address its tech debt challenge if they're really going to move into the modern AI era?
I think that's a really important observation because you're right. When we think about sectoral adoption of technology, beyond kind of defense applications, financial services in the public sector were probably at the leading edge in the 70s and 80s when it comes to tech adoption. So there's a lot of history there. I myself, early in my career, replaced a registration system. So in a DMV, a vehicle registration system, and I can remember we all celebrated the 30th birthday of the system we were replacing before we'd even put the new one in place. So these are real challenges that exist out there, Steph. You're right. I think what's difficult is definitely the budget element. There is also a bit of a decision-making and risk aversion dimension to tech debt. And so I think there is a need to change some of the governance models around how we do some of this decision-making. I think that's where things like the Technology Modernisation Fund in the US federal government has been really powerful. And to be honest, that was a fund that, wasn't maybe getting as much attention as it could have in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. But what we're seeing now is a real uptick. And I think some of that is being driven exactly by what you said, Steph, the need to really go back and have a look at this stuff and unlock some of the data. I don't want to overplay the data element and the infrastructure element too much, though, I guess, from the perspective that, in the public sector, there is still this people problem that we have to get around. Despite it not being high on the agenda, when I actually talk to mission leaders and tech leaders and business leaders, the issue of skills, getting access to people, so actually bringing new civil servants in to do the work can be difficult too. Now, obviously, if we can address some of the tech debt and put some modern systems in, maybe that makes roles more appealing. But there are certainly some other challenges as well beyond the technology. Like I say, I think one of the things the US federal government has done really well, and a number of other jurisdictions have followed suit, is these centralised drawdown funds for dealing with tech debt, right? Recognising that it has to be paid down. And it's very difficult for individual agencies to maybe make the case for that money. And so having a centralised pot that's dealt with at the civil service level, not at the legislature, is a great solution.
So, Sam, have you seen some cool examples of where public sector has, I think this was Steph's point earlier, like that innovative use cases where, it stands out, and the positive impact of how they're incorporating AI into whether that's engaging with citizens or public health? Like, what are some cool examples that you've seen out there across the globe?
Yeah, great question, Sri. It's interesting you should say innovation as well. One of the things we asked was, which of the following factors do you think will produce the most benefits for generative AI in organisations? And public sector, unlike private sector, actually nominated innovation as the top driver. And I think that's really interesting because if we go back to what Steph and I have spoken about previously in terms of tech debt, some of the constraints, I think this, disruption question, this sense in the public sector, there's a lot more disruption that could come, is actually positive disruption. I think public sector mission leaders and others are really searching for something that can transform public services in the next 10 years, address things like demographic challenges, some of those recruitment challenges I talked about. But one of the really cool examples I saw, and it's a customer-facing example, and I will say before I launch into this description that customer-facing use cases for AI is an area where the public sector and private sector differ markedly. So there's much more sensitivity about the use of generative AI and AI solutions in a public-facing sense. So that is something that the public sector is very mindful of, right? We have to have things that are well tested and well understood before we release them on the public. So a really great example I saw recently was a state government in the US that had partnered with, in this case, Google as a large tech platform, and was using large language models to actually put a really clean interaction layer over the top of traditional application forms. Now, I don't know about you, but I've seen plenty of application forms in government in my life, and some of them are pretty terrible. And you're never 100% sure whether what you're filling in is going to get you the result or outcome you're looking for. And that's partly because the government is trying to serve so many people. So as a result, we get these generalized forms, and things like unemployment insurance can be one of those cases where, if I've been unfairly fired, if I've been let go because of some underlying health issue or whatever the reason might be, actually explaining that, in an application form can be pretty tricky. And so this state government actually put a conversational interface over the front that basically took the idea of, rather than having an assessor, right, within the agency do a post-application interview, right, they were using the large language model and conversational AI to actually interview the applicant at point of application and then generate an application form at the back end and present both artifacts to the assessor. So the assessor gets the legislated required application form, in the formal format that's required by the legislation to be submitted for the claim, but also already had an interview transcript up front, which saves that assessor time to go back, ask questions. And of course, because the language model is working with probabilities, what is the most likely follow-up question given the particular circumstances of, say, my unemployment insurance application or social security application, then it was effectively tailoring the interaction, right? Now, it didn't know anything about the applicant. It wasn't personalizing it in that sense, but it was able to personalize the conversation for the interaction. And I just thought that is fantastic. That is great because, if you've got people with low literacy, if you've got people that are concerned about just interacting with government because of that, kind of please fill in the form and submit the application, we'll stamp it and send it through the process. You are lowering the barrier for entry for people, particularly minority groups and those that might be in more difficult circumstances than us.
Yeah, I love that example. Who knew form filling can be fun?
Yeah, exactly. You've heard it here first. Form filling in government will be fun in the future.
Yeah, so it's interesting how, in some ways, government is taking the lead on these use cases. The interesting thing, when I look at our trust research, trust in government isn't as terrible as people think it is. It's not great. I think banking might have like the highest trusted relationships with their individual consumers, and actually it does vary by country. In some countries it is terrible. In other countries it's just like average to okay. So when we think about these AI use cases, or if we think about generative AI in particular, we also know from our research that the number one levers of trust, particularly in government, are going to be integrity, empathy, transparency. Do we think citizens and the customers of the government are going to be more likely to trust the government more or less after the deployment of some of these AI use cases? I mean, on the one hand, I could see, if I'm going to tee you up a little bit or maybe lead the witness, I guess I could almost see it working out two ways, which is there are some scenarios, and like here in the U.S., for example, like when the sentences that judges hand out change a lot, whether they're tired. You're likely to get a more lenient sentence earlier in the day than you are at the end of the day. And of course, there's all kinds of like bias. So maybe somebody would actually welcome AI in that scenario where, it's a machine applying an algorithm and it's not left up to human bias and human mistakes and human impulses. Or you could also say, well, given the current state of our political discourse, people will see AI as being abused and the government applying it as like an AI overlord. And so I can almost see it going like both ways, where people welcome it, but or they actually might fear it because of the current political environment.
And I think they're great observations, Stefan. It maybe is a case of we're at a fork in the road here in terms of how this will play out. And it may be that it's kind of context specific. We know that when AI, machine learning models have been used in sentencing, for example, that, the risk of bias, particularly around particular socioeconomic and ethnic groups, is a problem, right? So the LAPD, for example, walked back from some of their machine learning based support for officers in the field because of some of those concerns. And we talked about that a couple of years ago in some of our research. We also had here in Australia, for example, a pretty horrific case of social security clawback that is colloquially known here as robo-debt. And there was a royal commission held into that, and our Prime Minister at the time was hauled before that inquiry to explain how an income averaging model had been allowed to be used to basically create debts against social security recipients. And so, it can be a problem in certain scenarios. In others, where we think about, for example, maybe procurement, where we don't want there to be a sense of corruption. We want there to be independence in decision making. I think that can be really interesting. Being able to use AI, for example, maybe to surface freedom of information materials to actually make government and hold government more accountable by placing machines in places that can do a better job of surfacing information maybe than a human being is something that I see potentially playing out in the future. I think at the end of the day, the interesting thing in that trust research you mentioned, Steph, too, is this real belief, despite, as you say, what people think about the public sector and government. And I do find myself having to say, there is actually a level of trust in government that exists. We depend on government for social cohesion and function. And when governments are not dependable, then it doesn't matter how much integrity they might attempt to display, transparency or empathy. They just can't really provide those basic services. And it is interesting to see in the data that consumers, if they are going to trust anyone to take care of the AI revolution, they are looking to the public sector and they're looking to government to do that. And so I've been really impressed with the way in which many policymakers and civil servants have really stepped up their interest in AI and the actions they're taking, and really pretty balanced approach, right? A lot of risk-based assessments have become the basis of regulation around the world. And I think that's appropriate. And that is how I would approach some of these situations that you're describing. Where can we use this? Which use cases make sense? I think we do have to look at, well, what is the risk of bias and what's the impact on the individual, right? So take your example of the court case and a judge a bit tired in the afternoon. Well, maybe letting the judge know that they're getting tired and they're starting to make more harsh sentences is something to tell a judge, but letting an AI make that decision, make that call, having an AI judge, I'm not sure I feel comfortable with that idea either.
I think I read an article somewhere of an AI board member. So, Sam, since it's prediction season, that might actually be a good prediction.
Oh, could be. I like it.
So in the beginning of the podcast, you used this term industry of industries, which I really liked. And I think talked a little bit about, the public sector being almost the pioneers of big data, if you will, right? And just in terms of the type of data that private sector has access to. We've not talked a lot about data. I know there's a lot of conversation about, you can't do good AI without good data, but you have to start somewhere. And, there's a lot, always goes back to a data quality issue. So tell us a little bit about what you're hearing, seeing on the data side of things as it pertains to growth and adoption of AI in public sector.
Yeah, the data dimension here, I think, is really interesting. So in our data and analytics survey of 2023, when we asked public sector respondents about the most important use cases for AI in their organisation, 36% actually said that they were going to use AI to improve data discovery, curation, processing, and quality. So this idea that we can use AI tools to really crack the nut of data management and data architecture, I think, is pretty exciting. I've been a data nerd all my life, and I have often remarked to people recently that, well, maybe we'll finally crack this thing, right? Because data management, data quality, information management, records management, all the terms that we hear in the public sector that kind of cover this data space are really pretty intractable problems, right? They're things that are tough to do. And as you said, Sri, the public sector is also this great wealth of information, right? We talk about the kind of sovereign data sets that, our individual jurisdictions hold and that we effectively ask government to hold on our behalf. And so that's really important. And I think the way we saw the open data revolution, I think can give us some hints as to how some of these data aspects of AI and generative AI will play out. There's also a cultural element. So we're seeing a lot of interest in culturally sensitive or cultural touchstone large language models. So those models that capture the nuance of language in their probabilities and in their neural networks in a way that makes the interaction with those models more appropriate for a given culture. And I think that's something that governments will get more involved in, right? How, as we increasingly rely on information to create these models, do we actually maintain a cultural identity, right? If everyone's using the same LLM or a same set of LLMs, and it is a big heterogeneous pot of data from the world over, look, that might be good in some elements, but it also risks us losing some of our cultural identity. So I think there's an interesting data thing happening there. But probably the biggest concern I have about the whole data question is this perception that is being peddled, not intentionally necessarily, but it's certainly the message that I'm hearing, and I think the clients are hearing, which is you can't have good AI, you can't have good generative AI unless you sort out your data architecture and data management, data quality issues first. And as I said before, we haven't cracked that nut in 50 years, so how are we going to do it now?
Yeah, it's interesting too. I hear you there. I mean, it's a little bit analogous to security 10 years ago. I remember when 10 years ago when security was making the shift from network-centric security to data-centric security. I heard the same refrain from CISOs. I'd go visit CISOs and talk to them about zero trust, which is very much a data-centric approach to security. They'd be like, wow, Forrester, we have petabytes of data. How am I going to inventory and classify all that and set up DLP policies? Like, it's never going to happen. And yeah, I hear you, because they can use that as an excuse to like not do anything, as opposed to figuring out where their most sensitive data is, and at least like start by the sensitive data, or coming up with an approach that will allow them to get started without having to bite off all of the petabytes of information they have. They could do division by division, country by country, or like I said, most of the approach was actually to go start with your most sensitive data first. So like I hear you there. I don't think anybody should use the excuse around data quality and access and having the right architecture as an excuse not to get started. But to some extent, you do need some good data. You do have to start somewhere. So there's got to be this balancing act between trying to fix all of your data problems, and then actually like having some essential data quality, some essential data security, some essential strategy around like the architecture and the foundation.
And I like those recommendations, Steph, because I think you've nailed it, right? You need a strategy. You need some clarity around this. And that's, I think, where the message is being lost, maybe when some of our high-tech participants in the sector kind of make these broad sweeping statements about getting data architecture and information management right. I think the other thing you touched on there is the importance actually of the role of the CISO and zero trust architectures in helping us prepare for accessing data in the right way. And so, again, while I don't want to then make myself a hypocrite and say, well, you can't do any of this until you've got zero trust in, I mean, these are great complementary strategies, and making sure that if you're a mission leader or a technology leader that's not in the cybersecurity space or not in the security and risk space, hasn't heard of zero trust, or has heard it, come out of the lips of your CISO and you're really not sure how it might benefit you, this is one of those cases where it absolutely will be worth every minute that you invested in it, in a way that prevents data from being accessed that shouldn't.
Okay, this is great stuff. If we were to leave our listeners with one final piece of advice, what would that be? I mean, we covered a lot of ground, technology, implementation, integration. What would that one piece of advice be for our listeners?
I think if I was to leave public sector mission, tech and business leaders with one piece of advice, it's a piece of advice that I saw from our Future of Work team here at Forrester, where they said people, not technology and data, are going to ultimately be the key to AI success. And that's a bold claim, and you would expect that from us here at Forrester, but I think it is a really important one. This is a general purpose technology. It isn't going away. It's going to find its way into everything we use and everything we do in some way, shape or form, if it hasn't already. And so making sure that our executives, our management, but more importantly, our frontline staff who are delivering public services day in, day out, really understand the basics of AI, that fundamental difference between deterministic and probabilistic computing. You don't expect to get $20 out of the generative AI ATM, right? Depending on how it's feeling on a given day, you might get 21 or 19. But the important thing here is to give people the skills And one of the things that we have been doing with clients for a long time has been assessing their readiness for these situations. And we originally had our robotics quotient, which is a way of measuring readiness in workforces, in our customers, around automation more broadly. And the future of work team at Forrester here have updated and upgraded that assessment to what we call our AIQ or AI quotient. And so I'd encourage all mission leaders to really get down and just measure how ready your workforce is to adopt these tools, because it's coming whether you're ready or not.
Thanks, Sam, for being on this podcast. It was a great conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on LinkedIn or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.